Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top items for ranked play in patch 11.5. The latest patch will help stabilize the chaos that patch 11.4 brought to the meta, so it's a great time to reassess the current top items. These items are commonly used throughout various compositions, some having more impact at certain stages of the game, while others do well throughout the whole game. Keep in mind that set 4.5 is still all about specific items for carries, so using early components is still a risk. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 10, we have Sunfire Cape coming in at number 10. It's interesting to see how item priorities shift from patch to patch. Some of the time, it's relatively unchanged, but in the case of Sunfire Cape, it seems to shift frequently. What doesn't change for Sunfire Cape is that it is one of the best early game items you can make. It can be used on any board because you're always going to have some type of frontline, and the damage it does peaks during the early stages of the game. Of course, that doesn't mean Sunfire Cape is completely useless late game, as the healing reduction can still be useful, especially against Slayers or Siphoner, since they have a lot of innate healing. But it's much worse to have to make a Sunfire in the late game than it is in the early game, especially with Morelanomicon rising in popularity, so if you really are in need of an item with healing reduction, then Sunfire Cape is not the highest priority. Thus, we're left with using Sunfire Cape primarily in the early game and maybe slightly into the mid game. Most commonly, it will either be made after the initial stage 1 drops or after the 2-4 carousel. Anytime past that, the effectiveness of the item will continually drop and the components tend to be used elsewhere. But all in all, Sunfire is an amazing early game item, and that's all it really needs to be. Moving along, we have Hextech Gunblade coming in at number 9. Honestly, it's really hard to pin down exactly where Hextech should be in terms of priority. There's quite a few champions that use it well, such as Aurelion Sol, Vigar, Katarina, and Nico. Even certain carries like Kale can make use of the item, though those types of champions have more specific item needs, so Gunblade is rarely a top priority for them. With so many champions being able to effectively use Gunblade, that means the priority should be higher, right? Well, no. The issue with Gunblade is that you really don't want to make it in the early game, so it's more of a mid to late game item. And you don't want to prioritize making it over other items like, say, Jouled Gauntlet, which uses the rod, or Deathblade, which uses the sword. Despite a lack of priority, Gunblade is in fact a good item. As mentioned, there's several champions that use it well, and the longer the game goes, the better it scales as your champion's damage increases. A lot of the time, it can be the reason why someone wins a round when their Nico 3 heals to full, or their Aurelion gets that all-important second cast up and lives with a sliver of health. Even though it's a lower priority, it's still a worthwhile investment later on in the game if you have the right champion to use it. Up next, coming in as the number 8 item, we have Deathblade. Whoa, hold on. Deathblade only makes it to the 8th spot on the list? What about the insanely high priority we've been putting on it for all of set 4.5? Okay, yes. Deathblade has been one of the best items, and it is still good. But after the changes it received in patch 11.4, that slowed down how quickly it scales, and now in 11.5, with it only starting at 30 damage, the fact is the priority for Deathblade will likely go down. Of course, it's completely possible that Deathblade will remain high in value since boosting the initial damage of an auto-attack champion is quite good. It's just as likely, though, that we see more and more players shifting away from prioritizing it and aim for other items like Giant Slayer or Infinity Edge. In fact, we've already seen subtle shifts in the item meta, with Last Whisper rising in priority. Setting aside potential item priority shifts, Deathblade is still going to be good in 11.5. Maybe it's a bit more niche than before, but slapping on an Olaf or a Samira will still be worthwhile. We just want to highlight the changes that it's received to open the door for players to experiment with other items. Let's move on to the number 7 item on today's list, Jouled Gauntlet. Jouled Gauntlet is another one of those items that has several champions that use it, but isn't always worth making it until the mid to late game. Main reason for this is that when you make a Jouled Gauntlet, you're likely setting yourself up for specific comps. Mages are the most common, with Jouled Gauntlet being amazing on Aurelion Sol, but there's also Nico and Vanguard Mystic. Beyond that, you may see it toss on a Kindred, Morgana, or even Kennen. But all of the champions Jouled Gauntlet truly excels on will limit the options you have in the mid game. Because of that limitation, you're unlikely going to want to prioritize making Jouled Gauntlet too early on in the game. And if you do, well, you're just signaling to the rest of the lobby what your intentions are later on. While all of this is hypothetical, keep in mind that most of the time when a player makes certain items, they will almost always lean into the comp that go well with them. This doesn't mean that players will always do this, just that the need to gain value from making an item tends to push them into that direction. Okay, so let's put aside the downsides of Jouled Gauntlet and focus on the positives. It does a lot of damage and excels on champions that can do damage multiple times, like mages or Nico. Finding the perfect champion to use it may not always be feasible, but there's several secondary options like Kennen, Morgana, Kindred, or even in the late game, Yone. Thus, it's safe to say that as far as ability power items go, it's one of the stronger ones in the current meta. Next up, we have Morelanomicon coming in at number 6. Surprise! Morelanomicon is back in the meta. It seemed like for a while that this item was going to remain fairly dead in the water, but we are seeing it gain priority as it goes well on specific champions. Those champions are Sejuani, Morgana, and Kennen, with several others capable of using it well. Early game, for example, you can toss down a Trist or Twisted Fate, so even though it's less effective than, say, a Sunfire Cape, you at least have effective item holders for it. Of course, the value that Morelanomicon brings is entirely dependent on what champions you end up with. If you're not hitting Sejuani or playing a build with Morgana, then this item does go way down in value. So it ends up being somewhat of a niche item due to the lack of champions that can use it well. Despite that, it does add a ton of damage to AoE based units, and the healing reduction is quite useful in a meta where Slayers are running rampant. Moving on to the middle of the pack, we have Runan's Hurricane coming in at number 5. Runan's lost a lot of priority when the change occurred in the 11.4b patch, where Olaf's Cleave no longer triggered from it. On top of that, there have been several bug fixes that have lowered the effectiveness of Runan's Hurricane. Yet despite all of those changes, we're still seeing it used frequently in the mid to late game. The reason for that is the damage increase it provides is still really good. Sure, it's not overpowered anymore, but having it on an Olaf or a Tryndamere is completely worth it still. Plus, there's Callista for duelists, Shyvana in brawlers, and even Zed can use the item well in the rare cases a player uses him. We may even see it rise in popularity if items like Infinity Edge take over Deathblade in the meta. All in all, Runan's has definitely become less of an all-around item and more niche to certain champions. But for those champions, it's one of the best items for them, which leaves Runan's Hurricane sitting in a comfortable number 5 spot. Up next is the ever-reliable Guardian Angel coming in as the number 4 item. Look, at this point, we all know Guardian Angel is a great defensive item. You can go on any champion that you simply want to live a little bit longer in a fight. This means carries like Kale, utility frontlines like Morgana, or simply a support unit like Zillion. There's endless applications for Guardian Angel, and we all know it by now. The only downside, really, is that players rarely prioritize making it in the early game over other items that you can use components for. Once you're hitting the mid-game, then slamming a Guardian Angel is perfectly fine to do. Alright, for the number 3 spot on the list, we're putting 2 items together. Those items are Shroud of Stillness and Zephyr. Generally, we avoid doing this, but we do have good reason for placing both Shroud and Zephyr in the same spot. Basically, these 2 items are S tier in the late game. No other item, utility or otherwise, really holds a candle to how useful these 2 items are once the game hits stage 5 and beyond. Shroud will slow down specific champs from casting quickly, which oftentimes is enough to straight up win a round. This is made even better if you can catch another player off guard, either by moving the champion with a Shroud at the last second, or cheesing it from your bench. Zephyr is similar, but instead removes 1 unit from the fight for a few seconds. Of course, it can be countered by Quicksilver, so you may not always be able to hit another player's carry, but there's always options with Zephyr. Whether that's the front line to prevent a champion like Sejuani from taking early damage to cast, or blocking an assassin from jumping to your backline. One last note for these 2 items is how well they pair with the Magnetic Remover from Lucky Lantern. It essentially allows you to cheese 2 rounds, first when you initially get the item, and second when you pop it off with the remover. Having the ability to do that without selling the champion holding the item is extremely effective. Next up, we have Last Whisper coming in as the number 2 item. Last Whisper rose up a lot in popularity near the end of 11.4. For the most part, we've only seen it used on Tryndamere, but several other champions are doing well with it, such as Sivir, Samira, Talon, and Xayah. Essentially, it's starting to replace other carry items like Deathblade. There's 2 main reasons why Last Whisper is doing well all of a sudden. First is that we're seeing Vanguards used frequently as the main frontline for a lot of comps, specifically Sejuani and Aatrox. Being able to effectively deal with armor-heavy frontlines is important, and Last Whisper helps with that. The second reason is champions like Samira, Talon, and Tryndamere all have ways to access the enemy backline. Being able to shred a squishy unit's armor basically guarantees they die shortly after. So you have an item that can help deal with hard-to-kill frontline champions and does well at assassinating backline units. That all said, we've pushed Last Whisper up into the number 2 spot, mainly to highlight it for players who are unaware of its rise in popularity. And the item coming in at number 1 for patch 11.5 is Hand of Justice. We tried really hard to find another item that could dethrone Hand of Justice, but there just isn't one. Hand of Justice is so good at every stage of the game and is usable by so many different champions that there's really no way for it not to take the number 1 spot. Really, the only downside to talk about when it comes to Hand of Justice is the fact that you're rolling the dice each fight as to whether you get healing or damage. But that gamble is definitely worth it for the value that Hand of Justice brings to your board. That's going to be it for our top 10 items for patch 11.5. Before we go, we have 2 really quick honorable mentions to talk about. The first honorable mention is Infinity Edge, as we mainly want to point out how well it synergizes with items like Last Whisper and Jouled Gauntlet. With Deathblade falling down in priority, we may see Infinity Edge begin to take its place, though this is speculation and may not end up happening. The second item to talk about is Locket. Since we already addressed a few early game items, we do need to mention Locket. It's not as common in lower ranks, but in high ranking games, you'll see this item slammed early quite often. This is because saving health early game is essential to placing well at the end of the game, and Locket is one of the best early game items at helping to mitigate damage taken. Alright folks, that's all we have for you for today. Overall, we're still seeing a diverse item meta, even though it's still all about specific items for carries. Let us know in the comment section below what items you're having success with, and if you think Static Shiv will be reworked again in future patches. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.